If this is your first time drafting Brothers War, or it's been a while and you need a refresher before jumping into your draft, this video is for you. We're going to cover the mechanics, the top commons in each color, some high-level draft strategy, and then review the 10 two-color archetypes and what makes those decks tick. We'll also touch on the instant speed removal and combat tricks, so when your opponent suspiciously leaves one green mana open, you'll know what card your opponent probably has. First, the mechanics. Up first is Prototype. Prototype creatures retain their abilities, but can be cast for a cheaper alternative cost, in which they will have smaller stats and their abilities are usually slightly weaker. While in your hand, on the stack, and in the graveyard, they retain their original color and cost. While on the battlefield as a prototype, they have the mana value and color they were cast for. For example, on Boulder Branch Golem. You could cast it as a 6/5 for 7 mana and gain 6 life, and it would be on the battlefield as a colorless artifact. Alternatively, you could cast it for its prototype cost, and it would be a green 3/3 for 4, and you gain 3 life. Next, Power Stones are token artifacts created by other cards like Argothian Opportunist and Stern Lesson. They enter the battlefield tapped and can be used to pay for artifacts and activated abilities. Now clearly, they can be used to ramp out the big artifact creatures, but every color pair can make use of them, either as sacrifice fodder with cards like Pendragon Strongbolt and Power Stone Fracture, or to get artifact ETB triggers like with Yoshin Dissident. Lastly is Unearth. Creatures with Unearth, like Scrapwork Cohort and Scrapwork Rager, can be cast from the graveyard, as a sorcery only for their Unearth cost. They enter the battlefield with haste and are exiled if it dies or at the end of the turn. Note they are not sacrificed, so your cards won't trigger, however they can be sacrificed for value before the end of the turn. Now note these are all artifacts, so you'll get to trigger your artifact ETB stuff with them, and they usually have strong ETB abilities themselves. Now let's dive into the top commons, starting with white, the strongest color in the set and a good place to start a draft. In at number 3, Ambush Paratrooper. For 1 and a white, you get a 1/2 human soldier with flash and flying, and for 5 mana, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a staple in any white deck. It's a fantastic 2-drop, puts pressure in the air early, and has a very relevant ability late in the game. It's also a soldier, which bumps it up a bit, and knowing this card exists, don't attack your 1/1s into 2 open mana early in the game. In at number 2, Airlift Chaplain. For 2 and a white, we get a 1/1 human cleric with flying. When it enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards. You may put a plains or a creature card with mana value 3 or less from among the cards milled this way into your hand. If you don't, put a +1/+1 counter on Airlift Chaplain. You need to build around this a bit, but its fail case is a 3 mana 2/2 flyer, a bit below the curve these days, but still very respectable. However, when it does hit, which it does a lot, it makes sure you hit your early land drops, or can keep the cards flowing by drawing you another creature. It's not a soldier, so it misses a bit there, but I would still play it in any white deck. And number 1, Scrapwork Cohort. For 4 mana, you get a 3/1 artifact creature soldier. When it enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token, and you can unearth it for 2 and a white. This is actually the best common in the set and a solid first pick. This card just does it all. It has solid stats, can play offense and defense. A 3/1 is actually a great blocker. It's a soldier, and it offers 2 artifact ETB triggers, and it can even be unearthed to do it all again. It's great in any white deck, but like many of the other commons in this Scrapwork cycle, it can easily be splashed in decks that aren't white. I especially like it in red-black, since after it's unearthed, it provides 2 1/1 bodies that can be sacrificed to other effects. Up next is blue. Although not undraftable, it is the weakest color in the set. Keep in mind that blue is primarily a support color, and these top commons will reflect that. Number 3, Machine Over Matter. Costs 1 less if you control an artifact creature. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. This card is as good as it is for precisely what I said a moment ago. It's a great support card in the aggressive decks like Blue-White Soldiers and Blue-Red Prowess. It does what you need it to do, get blockers out of the way, and get your opponent dead. Don't take these early though, they are taken around picks 10 through 11 on average. Number 2 is Mightstone's Animation. For 3 and a blue, you get an enchantment aura, enchant artifact. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. Enchanted Artifact is a creature with base power and toughness 4/4 in addition to its other types. You need to build around this, make sure you have plenty of targets, either by generating Power Stones or playing the trinkety artifacts like Chromatic Star and Energy Refractor. But once you clear that bar, this is arguably the best reason at common to play blue in Brothers War. Be careful you don't get blown out when trying to cast this, but sticking a 4/4 for 4 that replaces itself is a big game. And playing this on a levitating statue is an absolute beating. Number 1, Combat Courier. For 1 mana, you get a 1/1 artifact creature construct. Pay 2 and sack it to draw a card, and then you can unearth it for 1 blue. So although not as obviously powerful as Mightstone's animation, this goes in a ton of decks, gets you on board early, and smooths out the first few turns of the game. Brothers War is a fast set, so having a way to make your deck more consistent and a place to dump extra mana is very helpful. You get all the benefits of him being an artifact, and it can even help you trigger the draw 2 payoffs. Up next is black. In at number 3, Moment of Defiance. For 2 and a black, you get an instant. Target creature gets +2/+1 and gains lifelink until end of turn. Draw a card. So this is actually the highest win rate black common, but the context of your deck matters a lot to make this card good, which is why I'm putting it in at number 3. Don't take these early as they usually wheel. In Brothers War, you often find yourself behind to an aggressive blue-white or red-white start. This card can help you win a combat, and the lifelink can swing races a ton into your favor. Plus, getting to draw a card is good regardless of the deck you're playing, but it's especially nice in blue-black to trigger the draw 2 payoffs. Number 2, Disfigure. For 1 black, we get an instant. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. Early interaction is always good, and this card usually trades up on mana, easily killing 2, 3, and sometimes even 4 mana plays from your opponent. Take them early and often. And number 1, Overwhelming Remorse. For 4 and a black, we get an instant. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature card in your graveyard. Exile target creature or planeswalker. This is your bread and butter black removal spell. This will often cost 1 or 2 mana in the mid to late game, and the exile is huge with all the unearth and other ways to recur threats in Brothers War. These are usually not available past pick 2 or 3. Next is red, and in at number 3, Pendragon Strongbow. For 2 and a red, we get a 2/3 creature Minotaur. For 1 mana, sack an artifact. Pendragon Strongbow gets +1/+1 until end of turn and deals 1 damage to each opponent. This card is the synergistic puzzle piece that helps squeeze value out of so many other cards in Brothers War. You have to build around it a bit, but once you do, the threat of activation on this is huge. It's great in any red deck, but I especially like it in red-black as a cheap, repeatable way to trigger your other sacrifice payoffs like Goblin Blast Runner. It can also steal games out of nowhere. I've won many games where my opponent has stabilized at 3 or 4 life. You drop a Strongbow and sack your board to finish them off. Number 2 is Scrapwork Mutt. For 2 mana, we get a 2/1 artifact creature dog. When Scrapwork Mutt enters the battlefield, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. You can also unearth it for 1 and a red. Like Combat Courier, this is a great early play to start pressuring your opponent while smoothing your draws. It's an artifact where that matters, and it can even unearth later for the last few points of damage or help mitigate flood in the late game. Great in any red deck and even playable outside of red if you need a good 2-drop. And number 1, Excavation Explosion. For 2 and a red, we get a sorcery. It deals 3 damage to any target. Create a tapped Power Stone. Unsurprisingly, the best red common. This is a great removal spell to get key blockers out of your way, or can even go face to finish off an opponent. Plus, the Power Stone can help you ramp out an early golem in red-green, or it can offer sack fodder in red-black. And finally, the best green commons. In at number 3, Boulder Branch Golem. This is the ideal curve topper at common in green for mid-range or slower decks. We've seen many different versions of this card over the past few years, and they're consistently top commons. This one is great too. Gaining 6 life when you're trying to stabilize against the aggressive decks is huge. Even if it's removed right away, you buy yourself at least another turn to find answers, and when you're really desperate, a 4 mana 3/3 gain 3 is still good. And since it's an artifact and can be ramped out with Power Stones, so if you build your deck right, this could even come down on turn 6 or sooner. In at number 2, Argothian Opportunist. For 2 and a green, we get a 3/2 creature Human Scout. When it enters the battlefield, create a tapped Power Stone. Just a solid creature that makes your green decks run smoother. The Power Stone can help ramp out creatures, can be sacrificed to the Strongbow or a Power Stone Fracture, triggers artifact ETB stuff. The card just always does what you want it to do. Just make sure you have ways to utilize the Power Stone. And number 1, Gaia's Gift. For 1 and a green, we get an instant, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains reach, trample, hexproof, and indestructible until end of turn. This is probably the best combat trick we've seen in the last few years. It's cheap and extremely versatile, lets you protect your creatures from removal, trample over a chump blocker, or surprise an opponent's flyer, and it even leaves behind the +1/+1 counter rather than providing a temporary boost. As good as this card is, you don't need to take them super high, as they tend to go around picks 8 or 9. Okay, let's touch really quickly on draft strategy. At a high level, Brothers War is a fairly balanced set, and I would be willing to draft any color pair except for blue-green. If I can, I would bias towards white and bias against blue in the early stages of the draft. Also, early in the draft, you want to take the trinket artifacts like Chromatic Star, Energy Refractor, Ichor Wellspring, and Elsewhere Flask, and all of these scrapwork creatures like Scrapwork Cohort, Scrapwork Mutt, and Combat Courier. Rager is fine, not a super high pick, as all these cards will go into most every deck and help you stay open and see what comes your way. Having a few trinket artifacts for your deck can also enable splashes for powerful uncommons like Skyfisher Spider and Third Path Iconoclast, or lets you pick up bombs, of which there are many, in packs 2 and 3 that you might open later. Now let's jump into the archetypes in order of highest win rate to lowest, starting with Red-White Unearth Aggro. The signpost uncommon for Red-White is Phalagi Vanguard. For 2 red-white, you get a 2/3 creature human soldier with first strike. When Phalagi Vanguard or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Like most red-white limited decks, you'll want to play cheap, aggressive creatures like Scrapwork Cohort, Scrapwork Mutt, and Ambush Paratrooper, backed up by efficient removal like Excavation Explosion and Obliterating Bolt, a sorcery for 1 and a red that deals 4 damage, and exiles, and some combat tricks to push through damage, like Military Discipline to give a creature +1/+0 and first strike, and Whirling Strike, an instant that gives a creature +2/+0, first strike, and trample. Pendragon Strongbolt is also quite good here, giving you some late game reach. Some powerful uncommons for this deck are Horn Stoneseeker, a 2-mana 2/2 menace that comes with a Power Stone, Giant Cindermaw, a 3-mana 4/3 trample, and Combat Thresher, either a 1/1 or a 3/3 double striker that when it enters the battlefield lets you draw a card. Up next is Blue-White Soldiers. The signpost uncommon for Blue-White is Yoshin Tactician. For 2 white-blue, you get a 3/4 human soldier. Other soldiers you control get +1/+1. Ideally, you'll want to start the draft in white, the stronger of the 2 colors, grabbing cards like Scrapwork Cohort, Ambush Paratrooper, and Aeronaut Cavalry before deciding on a second color. Some good commons in blue to support your powerful white cards are Weakstone's Subjugation, Machine Over Matter, Mightstone's Animation, and Wing Commando. Some powerful uncommons for this deck are Zephyr Sentinel, a 2-mana 2/1 flash flying that could protect a soldier from removal, Recruitment Officer that allows you to dig through your deck for additional creatures, and Yoshin Frontliner, a powerful aggressive 1-drop. Next is Blue-Red Prowess. The signpost uncommon for Blue-Red is Third Path Iconoclast. For Blue-Red, you get a 2/1 Human Monk. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token. So this is a spells deck, yes, but you can also trigger all of your prowess creatures like Monastery Swiftspear and Wing Commando with the trinket artifacts like Chromatic Star and Elsewhere Flask, and you can use Mightstone's Animation to great effect in this deck since it triggers prowess and you should have plenty of artifacts laying around to animate. Besides the generically powerful uncommons we've already mentioned, like Horn Stoneseeker and Giant Cindermaw, powerful uncommons for this deck are Thopter Mechanic, a 2-mana 2/1 that grows whenever you draw a second card, Levitating Statue that gets stronger as you cast non-creatures, and Mishra's Research Desk, a great way to dig through your deck. Up next is Red-Green Power Stone Midrange. The signpost uncommon is Arbalist Engineers. For 1 red-green, you get a 2/2 Human Artificer. When it enters the battlefield, choose 1. It can deal 1 damage to any target, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, it gains trample and haste until end of turn, or create a tapped Power Stone. This is a classic red-green beatdown deck that wants efficient threats like Scrapwork Mutt, Argothian Opportunist, Giant Cindermaw, and Obstinate Baloth. Remove pesky blockers with Excavation Explosion, and the fight spell for this set, Epic Confrontation. Boulder Branch Golem is great in this deck to stabilize the board and turn the corner against more aggressive decks. Some other powerful uncommons for this deck are Mask of the Jadecrafter, a great place to dump mana in the late game, and Audacity, a great way to push through damage with a card like Boulder Branch Golem. Up next is Green-White, Artifact ETB Matters. The signpost uncommon is Yoshin Dissident. For Green-White, you get a 1/1 Human Artificer. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. This is another assertive deck that wants Scrapwork Cohort, which can generate 4 artifact ETB triggers on its own, Ambush Paratrooper, and Airlift Chaplain, but it uses green for Argothian Opportunist, Gaia's Gift, and Boulder Branch Golem. Combat Thresher and Mask of the Jadecrafter are good in this deck as well, and Sarenth's Steelseeker is a nice early play that's really easy to trigger in this deck and generates tons of value. Green-Black is a Graveyard Matters deck, but unfortunately the graveyard synergies didn't really get there in this set. The Signpost Uncommon, which is very splashable due to its overall power level, is Skyfisher Spider. For 2 black-green, we get a 3/3 creature spider with reach. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another creature. When you do, destroy target non-land permanent. When Skyfisher Spider dies, you may gain 1 life for each creature card in your graveyard. If you do, exile Skyfisher Spider. Take the good green creatures and black removal as a base. Overwhelming Remorse is good in any deck, but especially good here. Disfigure, Argothian Opportunist, and Boulder Branch Golem. Now Ravenous Gigamole is really good here, as is Emergency Weld, but Gixian Skullflare is barely playable and really not a reason to be in this deck, and Wasteful Harvest is a card to be avoided. It's just too slow. Besides the always good cards that we've mentioned for other color pairs, again, Mask of the Jade Crafter, Obstinate Baloth, other cards like Go for the Throat, Ashnod's Harvester, and Gnawing Vermin are also good in this deck. Black-white is mana value 3 or less matters. The Signpost Uncommon is Hero of the Dunes. For 3 white-black, we get a 3/2 Human Soldier. When it enters the battlefield, return target artifact or creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Creatures you control with mana value 3 or less get +1/+0. Again, the best commons for this deck are the aggressive white creatures, backed up by good black removal, and some combat tricks like Military Discipline and Moment of Defiance. Recruitment Officer is especially good here, and although not a strong early pick, this deck can squeeze value out of Recommission off the back of the Self-Mill from Airlift Chaplain and Ravenous Gigamole. Next up is Red-Black Sacrifice. The Signpost Uncommon is Junkyard Genius. For 1 black-red, we get a 2/2 Human Artificer. When it enters the battlefield, create a tapped Power Stone. 1 black-red and sack another creature or artifact. Until end of turn, other creatures you control get +1/+0, Menace, and Haste. As expected, Scrapwork Mutt is very good here, as is Goblin Blast Runner, which can be easily triggered with Pendragon Strongbow, the synergy glue of this deck. Evolving Wilds is actually really strong here as well as a free sacrifice trigger. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the best commons for the deck is Scrapwork Cohort, providing good stats and tons of sack fodder. Powerstone Fracture is another great way to use up artifacts you have laying around and get a sacrifice trigger in the process. And there is a steel card in this set, Sibling Rivalry, which is quite good here, but can be picked up late in the pack. Next is Blue-Black Draw 2. The Signpost Uncommon is Evangel of Synthesis. For blue-black, you get a 2/3 Phyrexian Human Cleric. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card, then discard a card. As long as you draw on 2 or more cards this turn, Evangel of Synthesis gets +1/+0 and has Menace. Although one of the weaker decks in the format, I'm willing to draft it if it's open, and I find this deck a lot of fun to play. As mentioned earlier, Mightstone's animation is a good reason to be blue, and it's quite good here if you can trigger your stuff with it as well, like the aforementioned Evangel and Thopter Mechanic, one of the best uncommons for this deck. All of the cheap trinket artifacts like Ichor Wellspring are good here, triggering your draw 2 payoffs and offering fodder for things like Powerstone Fracture. And Trench Stalker is a powerful finisher in this deck, stabilizing you against aggro thanks to its fairly easy to trigger Death Touch and Lifelink. And since no other color pair really wants it, if you're in blue-black, they tend to come pretty late as well. And finally, Blue-Green Powerstone Ramp. The Signpost Uncommon is Battery Bearer. For 2 green-blue, we get a 3/4 Human Artificer. Creatures you control have tap, add colorless. This mana can't be spent to cast a non-artifact spell. Whenever you cast an artifact spell with mana value 6 or greater, draw a card. So it turns all your creatures into Power Stones. The idea here is to ramp out giant artifacts like Boulder Branch Golem, which is good, and Death Charge Colossus, which is not, and start beating down. You really need some good bombs to make this deck worth drafting, as ramping a turn or 2 early into a prototype common or uncommon just isn't good enough. Unfortunately, the set is just too fast, and unless the draft is beating me over the head that blue-green is open, I would likely avoid this deck. Lastly, let's cover the instants. Winning games of Limited can often come down to one key turn where you could have played around a combat trick. Now, I've shown you many of these at this point in the video, so here's a little quiz. I'm going to flash a mana cost on screen, and you guess what card I'm representing. Feel free to pause the video if you want to think about it. Now, these aren't all of the instants in Brothers War, but these are some of the most commonly played cards to keep an eye out for. Let me know in the comments how many you get right. Here we go. White, Military Discipline, 1 and a white, Ambush Paratrooper. Blue, Machine Over Matter for the discount. Black, Disfigure, 2 and a black, Moment of Defiance, 1 and a red, Whirling Strike. Green, Giant Growth, one in a green, Gaia's Gift. Bookmark this helpful guide below for your first few drafts as you get a handle on what instants exist in the format. So that's it for Brothers War. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more draft strategy videos just like this. Thanks for watching.